All right. Hello, everyone. We are back for a discussion today. This is going to be part 2, I think, of our series on archetypes and tropes. So Dr. A.P. Canavan has been kind and generous enough to join me for this series, which I'm excited for, actually. I think this will be fun for our viewers. Our first discussion was about the wise sage / clever magician archetypes. So we had a good time talking about that. That discussion is on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon. And I highly recommend that you go on over there and check out not only that video, but all of his fantastic content. I always learn something when I watch an AP Canavan video. So I'm sure it will be the same for you. Right, AP?
Well, quite often what you learn is how not to make a YouTube video.
Well, I didn't say what I learned, did I? So, but no, it's great to have you here, AP. Thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. And today's discussion on archetype is going to be on the Rogue, Jester, Trickster archetype. So we have a lot of examples of that we want to bring from modern fantasy, but also some older stuff as well. And it's fun to talk about these things because not just because we can say, oh, here's one and here's one and here's one in these different books we've read, but because they do perform certain functions. And these are recognizable universal functions, an archetype being something that is a sort of universally recognized pattern or figure that when we see it, we know it, and it performs, and it can perform an important psychological function. And for many authors, these archetypes can be something to toy with, something to play with. So you will see sometimes subversions or inversions of these archetypes coming from many clever authors. So there's a lot to discuss when it comes to rogues and jesters and that sort of thing. So AP, what would be some, for you, a good example or two of a figure who is the quintessential rogue / or jester, because there are slight variations here, and you'll see that when we talk about the examples.
Yeah, because Jung isolates the rogue as one thing and the jester as another. And again, like a lot of these archetypes, some of them are paired up and they have a deep connection. And we saw that with sage and magician. In some respects, they're two sides of the same coin. And you can think of the rogue or the outlaw, the rebel as one archetype, and then jester is something slightly different. So if we think of the rogue, the sort of the classic example that a lot of people will immediately recognize, that I think is a good example of this, is Robin Hood. Yeah. Robin Hood is a thief. Like, he is breaking the law, but he's doing it for the right reasons, morally good reasons. He's stealing from the rich, famously, to give to the poor. So he doesn't really care about societal norms. The norm would be you obey the law. He goes beyond that. He has a different moral code. He rebels against what he sees as an injustice, and the consequences be damned. That's who Robin Hood is as a character. And we can see a lot of that in a lot of fantasy groups, where you quite often have a thief character or a rogue character, and it's the thief with the heart of gold. That this is tying into very much that archetype of having a moral compass, not obeying society's laws for the sake of obeying society's laws, and always trying to do the right thing, even if you're using means that are not necessarily approved of.
Right. Yeah. So you made a very important distinction there, I think. And that's something I want to just focus on for a moment. And this, I think, is the difference between the rogue and the trickster. If we talk about tricksters in the classical sense, we look at somebody like Loki or Anansi. These are figures going way back in mythology. And these are individuals who can be forces of chaos, let's say. And I don't think that we can say that their motives are necessarily good. But when we're talking about the rogue, somebody like Robin Hood, heart of gold, this person is, yes, a mischief, perhaps even an outlaw in some sense, but there is a guiding moral compass there, and they inevitably seem to, whether reluctantly or not, they seem to do work for the good side in most stories. So the rogue may seem like the bad fella in the leather jacket, but really there's this heart of gold there, and they end up doing the right thing and helping out the company in a way that is sometimes even sacrificial. So that's, I think, an important distinction, right, between just the rogue, who ultimately comes out on the side of usually the forces of good, and then the trickster, who is just simply a force of chaos and sows chaos and can be destructive as well.
And yet we see that complexity, because obviously the trickster is a different tradition. It's a different way of thinking about these things, and it's an encapsulation of different aspects.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to be clear to people who thought that maybe we thought that Trickster was one of Jung's archetypes. It's
Right.
not a Jungian archetype.
Right.
It's from a different tradition. But if one of the things that's very interesting, and to go back to D&D and RPGs, on the moral alignment chart for D&D, it actually has two different axes.
Yeah.
You have lawful, neutral, chaotic,
Yeah.
and then you have good, neutral, and evil, which
Yeah.
leads to that grid where you could be lawful good, but you can also be lawful evil.
Yeah.
You can be chaotic good, you can also be chaotic evil. So it's different ways of thinking about it. You think of that sort of change over time, or the idea of a spectrum where a character is going to fall. And I think a lot of the Jungian archetypes for the rogue or the outlaw or the rebel fall very much into what we would consider chaotic good.
Yes.
That they are more on the good side of things, acting on behalf of the hero.
Yeah.
And we see developments of that where they become the hero of their own story. Robin Hood is the hero of that story. He's not a companion to the hero. But you still see that concept at the core of it, that it is about being good, but doing it in a bad way. Or, do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. And a perfect example being Han Solo, I think, whom you actually look a little bit like him today with your outfit there. In the original Star Wars trilogy. Yeah, so he's a good example, right? Han Solo of this chaotic good, and very reluctant to go along with the good people at certain points, but nevertheless, you can see underneath the snarkiness and the sarcasm and the pretend villainy that he's actually a pretty decent fellow.
Well, and this is one of the things actually to talk about, that one of the changes that Lucas made to Star Wars when he did the re-released version with the extra CGI, and they changed the fact that Han shot first. And Star Wars fans were up in arms about this, going, Han shoots first, that's how it was, it now looks silly, and all these different reasons. The reason I'm annoyed about it, the reason it annoys me, and it's why I've never watched that version past the first time to go, oh, hang on a sec, that's not right, is because it changed Han Solo's character arc from someone who was morally reprehensible. He was a smuggler. He shoots someone in cold blood. He acts first. He's headstrong. He has all of these bad habits. He has these moral flaws. But we then have a character arc where through the quest, he becomes good. He changes, he learns, he evolves. But by having him shoot second, he now appears as a chump, because it was clear that Greedo was going to try and shoot him. They have this really weird physics of where that bolt goes next to his head, which doesn't make any sense anymore. And it reduces the development of his character over the arc of the films. And that's why I objected to that, because he was a great rogue figure, because he wasn't a good guy. He was slimy and scummy, and he fitted right in Mos Eisley, that den of villainy.
Right.
And it's over the quest, learning from the sage mentor of Obi-Wan, seeing Obi-Wan's sacrifice, being around the hero Luke, learning from these things that he comes to value things greater than his own skin, greater than himself. He evolves as a character. And I thought that was so important for his arc.
Hmm.
And it moved him very much into this morally good thief rogue archetype. And
Yeah.
so you had that lovely transition. But with him shooting second, you lose a lot of that he gets far less development, and it's more choppy.
Right. Yeah, no, it's, I think you're right. I preferred the original version myself as well. And the development of that character, and that certainly was a mistake. But you reminded me of so many other characters as you were talking too. And one, I know you haven't read it yet. Maybe someday I'll convince you to, is Jalan from Mark Lawrence's Red Queen's War trilogy. And this is a character who, again, starts off morally reprehensible. And he says right from the beginning, this is not a spoiler. There will be, by the way, there are going to be spoilers in this video for some of the stories we're talking about. I'll put a warning. But Jalan is a character who starts off basically first-person narrator who confesses right from the beginning, I'm a liar and I'm a jerk and I'm this and that. And I'll never let anybody down, though, if he's a friend, unless it's in my interest, and starts out that way. And it's a really cool thing to watch his progression. In this case, he is the central character. But a lot of it is about his relationship with another character, Snorri, that develops through the course of the trilogy, which is one of the major catalysts for what happens to him. So it's pretty cool to see that, because I think you do capture a lot of the complexity of a human being when you take somebody who is quite morally imperfect and you watch that person get pushed into places and go with people and have some of that rub off on them and become a more lovable version of themselves through the course of that. And that's something you get with, I think, both Han Solo and Jalan from Red Queen's War trilogy. I'm sure that there are many other examples. You had one that you mentioned to me that I haven't read yet, and that was Prince Keldar.
Yeah, from David Eddings, the Belgariad,
Yeah.
and also from the Malorian. Keldar, Silk, he is very much the stereotypical rogue rebel outlaw, sort of in Eddings thing. In fact, Eddings is a great example of a lot of these archetypes. He seems to almost take them as, this is the blueprint for the character that I want to put in the story. He uses them very much that way. Of course, he blurs the edges a wee bit, as all authors do. You don't put just wholesale, they are just this one thing.
Right.
Authors are smarter than that. And Keldar he's a prince, but he's a spy, he's an assassin, he's a thief. He's obsessed with making money. Which it's really bizarre that he has this. He's a noble. He's a thief. He's an assassin, and yet anytime the group has a chance to negotiate or make a trade deal or anything like this, he's there trying to get the best possible deal. And you go, dude, you're on a quest to save the world. Why are you wasting time trying to make money out of this deal? Right. Why not? You need a certain amount of negotiating so that people don't remark on it. But because you screw over all of these people, they're all going to remember it was you. And then when someone's looking for you, they're going to be able to track you down. Right. So he acts actually against the interests of the party. But I think that's more maybe a mistake of Eddings' writing rather than a problem with the character. I think it was more how Eddings wrote it. But he's fascinating because he ties into the rogue, the outlaw, very much. But he has elements of the jester as well, because the jester is, in some respects, quite like a Picaro. They're very often the comic relief. They're very often the sidekick. They quite often reveal truths through their humor. And in the modern day, we're used to these sorts of cynical thief characters where they are sarcastic. They have the one-line quips in all of the best situations. And Locke Lamora from the Lies of Locke Lamora is a very interesting character in that regard.
Yeah,
because you've read that.
Yes, yeah, I've read the first three books. They're the ones that have been written so far in the Gentleman Bastard sequence, and you're absolutely right. I think Locke Lamora is a great example of the rogue, the thief, literally in this case, with the heart of gold. And he's a character who, in reality, would be a terrible thief because he has a conscience, I think, and because he wants to do the right thing all the time, and he wants to be. I mean, there are certain. I mean, I don't want to give things away too much here, but he has these relationships that are so important that, and I think that's one thing that Scott Lynch in that series does really well so far is the relationships, particularly between Locke and Jean, his friend. But yeah, you see him always, Locke Lamora, always being put in these positions where he will inevitably do the good thing, not the thing that would make him rich, not the thing that would make him. So there's a little bit of a, I don't know. Of course, I can't talk too much about it, but they have a different purpose besides just being thieves, I guess, too.
Yeah, but like Locke always reminds. I know the setting is very much sort of almost like a Renaissance Venice.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
the setting and Locke as characters, it reminds me so much of a Dickensian London with Locke as the Artful Dodger. You know, straight out of Dickens. He is that lovable rogue. He is that, you know, with the cherubic smile and the smudged cheeks, and he's, you know, he reminds me very much of the Artful Dodger. That there is a darkness to Dodger's character.
Oh yeah.
There's a darkness to Fagin, like a lot of darkness to Fagin, even if you ignore the anti-Semitism often attached to the character.
Right.
But Locke Lamora, when I read The Lies of Locke Lamora, I was very much struck as this is Oliver Twist in Fantasyland. Like that's the feeling I got from that entire novel, and I loved it.
Yeah.
But again, when we talk about these archetypes, it's a way of seeing to an aspect at the heart of the character, but then looking at how the author has made it more than that. And we can see, like, Locke is far more complex than a simple Robin Hood caricature, although we can see aspects of that in him at his core. But by looking at those differences, at looking at what Lynch has added to it and played with, it gives us a greater appreciation of what's going on with the character. And I think we can see that in aspects of the Jester as well, because obviously in Hobbes' realm of the Elderlings, you have the Fool.
Yes.
And the Fool goes beyond. The Fool is initially sort of presented as the stereotypical Jester archetype, the wisdom and truth through their jokes, that the Fool articulates things that other people can't see, that the Fool sees to the heart of things but uses jokes and japes as a way to tell the truth to the royalty, to the nobles. And yet Hobbes goes so much beyond, so far beyond that very limiting one-dimensional aspect of the Fool's character to develop this brilliant, nuanced, complex character.
Yeah, so I would say that she even bleeds that character into the wise sage at moments as well. I mean, there's a lot of complexity there. Yeah.
And mapping that sort of where you go, there's a moment that is very much in the Jester mode. Here's a moment where we can see it's much more in the sage mode, and we can see these movements then within the text, within the narrative, and you can see these different sort of poles that have been used to help construct that entire character, that there are these elements, and by identifying them, you can see these movements, you can trace these developments, and it's a really interesting way to try and break down characters to find how they work.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a similar kind of complexity and blending in a couple other characters I'd love to talk about. One, you mentioned the Jester, and I think Tyrion Lannister from A Song of Ice and Fire is another one that has elements of this in his character. And as you said before, also it mixed in with the I guess the aspects of him that are I guess I want to talk about how his form of wisdom is or insight into humanity is something that becomes an important part of his character, even as that comes out very cynically, particularly in the beginning. But
Because
I think he fits in some
I would
ways.
see him far less about wisdom and far more about intelligence. So I would actually see him as this, part of it being the jester figure, but moving to parts of the magician, the intelligent guiding
Mhm.
mentor rather than the wise guiding mentor. Because
Right.
I think he's less sage. Because let's face it, Tyrion makes some terrible choices.
True.
It's less about wisdom and more about he is smarter than everyone else.
Right.
Um, but there is that aspect. It is about his cynical humor. It is about making the jokes that only work because there's a biting truth at the heart of them.
Right. I would say that he definitely starts out more on the side of cleverness, but that through his arc, I feel like he's moving more toward the side of wisdom, or edging closer to it anyway. But we don't know how it's going to finish, obviously, because of Song of Ice and Fire, unless you count the HBO show, um, it remains unfinished. So
Yep.
we won't talk about that.
But again, I mean that's a brilliant point in that while we can use these archetypes to talk about the character,
Yeah,
because we can, like we've just mentioned with Tyrion, this movement towards something else, so we can see a transition.
yeah,
And these archetypes, while this is not what Jung intended for them, but it's
right,
how we can use them in literary criticism by using them to pinpoint these movements.
right.
And like you pointing out that movement toward from a more magician point to the sage point
Hmm.
helps us see that arc, helps us see that development,
Yeah,
and how he moves away. While he has always keeps elements of the jester, but we see again movements away from it and then movements back towards it, and it gives us that sense of all of these complex aspects to the characterization that George R. R. Martin put in his work.
yeah,
And again, like I think I mentioned this in the other video that we did. It's authors, and the more modern the author, usually the more complex and more nuanced characters that we get. There's this development of sophistication and complexity
hmm,
that creeps into a lot of these things. So something like Eddings, which was a lot more bald-faced in what it was doing, and then there's this movement far more now towards fully realized, much more literary approaches to characterization.
yeah. Interesting. So another example of a slightly more modern one might be Matt from Wheel of Time, where you get a rogue type character who is a bit of a jester as well, who does develop through that very long series, and into something a little bit more complex. I think it's fair to say, right?
Yeah, and there's another archetype that really comes into play with Matt, and he kind of bounces between them, and it's the archetype of the adventurer, the explorer.
Uh-huh.
But there are actually other characters in Wheel of Time that are much better articulations of that. But yeah, Matt is this roguish character. We can
Yeah.
see that in him, but we also see that he's a source of a lot of the early humor that is implanted in the novels, and he is a source. He's one of the characters that gets some of the best jokes.
Yeah. So
Uh, it,
he's kind of like the Pippin of of Wheel of Time. Speaking of Pippin, um, do you think that Pippin fits with this in this discussion as a bit of a jester, among the hobbits and in their party in Lord of the Rings?
um, I, Pippin is strange because in some respects, Pippin could be seen as a bit of a jester, but has much more of a deeper connection to one of the other archetypes, which would be the innocent.
Yeah.
So it's while like when we try to think of literary examples of these characters, and we're trying to keep it to fantasy and science fiction that people will have read or seen, it becomes more difficult because a lot of modern stuff is much more complicated, and I think with jesters, uh, if you think of a quest party where there's always one character who is the comic relief, who makes the quips, who's doing all of those things, that's generally who the Jester character is. And
Mm,
Pippin doesn't quite fit that.
right.
Pippin is, there's aspects of it, but
Hmm.
he seems to be much more connected to say the innocent.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think. We must have other ones that spring to mind for Jester.
Well, I would say maybe Mr. Nancy in American Gods, because although he is based on, slight spoiler for American Gods, I mean, the name sort of gives it away, and you wouldn't recognize it pretty quickly right there and then. But he is based on Anansi, the trickster god, and though I've said before that tricksters are different from jesters in that tricksters are forces of chaos. I think that Gaiman takes Mr. Nancy and makes him into more of a jester in a way, and in some ways a little bit of the wise sage, because he does sort of help Shadow in many respects. So yeah, it's interesting, but I think he's an example possibly of the jester. He certainly is a funny character. And he along with Wednesday as well. I mentioned earlier to you when we weren't recording that Wednesday is in some ways a bit of a rogue too, although again very different in other respects too, because he's got other things going on in his personality, but certainly in American
And he's
God.
quite dark. We
Yeah.
don't typically associate darkness with the Jester, and I think this is one of the things when you think of these Jungian archetypes. Quite a lot of them are framed very much in the positive heroic mold. So
Mhm.
if you put up a dark mirror next to it to see their dark reflections,
Yeah.
so the dark reflection of the sage, the dark reflection of the magician, the dark
Right.
reflection of the jester, you can
Right.
actually double the number of things, and you can see it because a lot of the stories that we are so invested in now are much darker and less
Yeah.
heroic than the literary traditions that a lot of this was drawn from.
So
So I
true.
think that's one way of thinking of, yes, they could be a jester, but they are a dark jester.
I
And
got one for
it's a
you.
nice way of adding that nuance.
Uh, how about Dandelion from The Witcher? Um,
And Dandelion seems the perfect
right.
jester character.
Yeah.
That and that it is why I mentioned the Picaro, which
Yeah.
is a classic example of this. But Dandelion is a perfect example because he is the comic relief in a lot of instances. He is the sidekick. He does accompany the hero, um, and he is that sort of articulation. But in his relationship with Geralt, in
Right.
some of the things that he does, he sees Geralt is while Geralt is very articulate and at times very verbose,
Hmm.
Dandelion as a fop is silly and foppish, but he sees to the truth sometimes of who Geralt is when
Yeah.
Geralt is maintaining a front.
Yeah.
And part of their friendship, part of their relationship that gets explored, just sort of sees to that it goes beyond. It goes to that aspect of the jester as someone who sees the truth, and quite often that's reflected through their humor or through their exploits.
Uh-huh. Cool. Yeah, I think we've given a lot of good examples, and I bet you, how much you want to bet? $1, a quid?
But that
Uh,
people in the comments are going to come up with far better ones.
yes, exactly right.
That
Yeah.
that is not a bet I am willing to take, Philip.
Okay. Well, all right. Anyway, so I think it's a safe thing to say that they are going to. I thought I was going to get a quid off you, man. No. So, so anyway, yes, yeah, I'm sure that we'll hear some great comments from our viewers, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening to us. I certainly had a great time, and AP, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about anything, really, anything fantasy related or what have you. So, just always an honor to have you here on the channel.
And it is always brilliant to be here. Thank you so much, Philip.
All right, then. Take care, everyone, and until next time.